Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Faith Focused Weekly Discipleship Podcast. My name is Kevin Rogness, and I'm the Discipleship Director here at Faith Covenant Church. And as always, I want to encourage you to subscribe, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to on any of the major podcasting platforms. And also leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing and what we can do better. Today, I'm really excited. I'm joined by a guest today. Her name is Rachel Wightman. She is the author of this book that I've been talking about recently called Faith and Fake News, A Guide to Consuming Information Wisely. If you've missed the last 3 episodes, we kind of delve into some of the stuff that she talks about. But it's a privilege for me, and I think a privilege for all of us, that we get to have Rachel joining us today. So Rachel, thank you.
Hi, nice to be with you. Thank you so much.
So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, your family, all that stuff before we delve into the book.
Sure, yeah. So I live in the Twin Cities. I talk about it in the book. I attend Mill City Church in Minneapolis. I'm originally from Illinois, and so have ended up here in the upper Midwest. And I'm a librarian, which is, a lot of times people make these assumptions like I'm just talking about books, I'm going to shush them. But I really came to my profession through teaching. I really love teaching and working. I work primarily with college students right now. I'm the associate director of library and academic support services at Concordia University in St. Paul. So working with college students, helping support them, and I love that work too. But I really love my work as a librarian in terms of like teaching people to find and use information in ethical ways. And so I've kind of spent the last almost 20 years really working in libraries, mostly in higher education. And like I said, I live in Minneapolis now. I've also been a missionary, worked in a library in Uganda for a while, in Minneapolis with my husband and son. And so we just are doing the toddler life with a lot going on.
All right. So yeah, and I think it's important for people to know that librarians, especially at like college campuses, they do a lot more than just check out a book and help you find a book.
Correct.
What does a librarian really encompass?
Yeah, so I work with, it can encompass a lot of different things, but I have spent my career in the area of what's called reference and instruction. So really teaching, I work with college students, but there are librarians that do this in public libraries as well, teaching people to find information. So that information might be in a book, but it might not be. It might be online, helping people evaluate that information. I also spend a lot of time with college students, helping them think about like their research topics and help them really like ask good questions and think about what they want to find out, and then find the information to answer those research questions. So yeah, it's a lot more than just checking out a book. In fact, I rarely check out a book. And there are other stuff that do that, which are also important. Other librarians also focus on things like the back end, making sure our systems work properly, and you can find that information. So yeah, it's a really cool profession in terms of it's very broad. It covers a lot of different things.
And it sounds like that profession served you well for this book. But this book actually started off as a class, from what I understand, at Mill City Church. I was actually interning there at the time. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you started off this class and how it then kind of evolved into a book?
Yeah, at Mill City Church, which or some of your listeners may have heard about, or I write about it in the book, the church offers regular classes called equipping hour classes, kind of like Sunday school. And over the years, I had seen people offer classes on a lot of different things that were everything from like Bible related topics to like very practical skills, like financial literacy or emotional health. And so I got to a point where in 2019, when we were all looking ahead to 2020 as an election year, if we can remember that far back, I was thinking, I know it feels like forever, and the world has literally changed since then. And so I was like having all these conversations with people about, the way they were interacting with news, how they were having conversations with people in their life about this upcoming election year, and candidates, and like it kind of just kept circling around this feeling of like people were overwhelmed by the news, they weren't sure what to trust, and then they weren't sure how to talk to the people in their life about the news. And so I approached the leadership at Mill City Church and said, I have these skills. This is how I teach college students about these things. Is there space to teach the church about how to find credible information, how to find a variety of viewpoints, and those kinds of topics? And so I offered that workshop in 2020 for the first time at Mill City. And it was right in the beginning of 2020. And I remember the last session. I feel like you might have even been there, Kevin. We were like in the library at the elementary school where Mill City met. And it was like, everyone's talking about COVID, and we're like wrapping up this 6-week workshop. And so it was I loved that opportunity. That was like my guinea pig class. I had never really done this type of workshop for a church before. I had mostly just worked with college students. And so the questions that those folks asked during those 6 weeks really helped shape a lot of my thoughts around all of these ideas, and how do people find credible news? How do they talk about it with the people they care about? How do they find differing perspectives? And helping people understand, the role that the media, especially social media, plays in how we see the world. And so I did that 6-week session, and then the world shut down with COVID literally a week later. And
Your
then
timing was perfect.
Yeah, it was great. I finished right before that happened. It was great. And then all the stuff that happened in the Twin Cities over the summer, with George Floyd being killed, and then and COVID, and the actual election did eventually happen. And so there was just all of these things happening, and I found myself having more and more of those conversations, even if they were online, and had the opportunity to offer that class again at Mill City. And then it's just slowly, it was a lot of word of mouth. Some local media, Minnesota Public Radio, ran a story about it because it was so unusual that a church would be saying, hey, how are people engaging? How are they seeking truth in a world that is full of misinformation? And I really keep coming back to this idea that as people of faith and as Christians, spreading misinformation is not loving our neighbors. And so that class was a way for me to help people avoid that. And then from there, the word of mouth, it was just kind of like word of mouth, the class, and then slowly more podcast interviews and opportunities to speak with more churches. And then eventually got connected with an acquisitions editor at Erdman's Publishing through a contact I had, and they published my book, which was really built off a lot of the concepts that had come to the forefront as I had been working with churches literally around the country. Which COVID made it so much easier to do, right? I've worked with churches all over because I was able to do it online with them, which was really cool.
Yeah. So since the book has come out, what is some of the fruit that you've seen come out of having the book out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few different things. Definitely, I've been able to engage with some more churches, which has been really fun. I've heard from folks that this was a good introduction into some of these topics. I really wrote the book to help fill a space. There are a lot of people doing really fantastic work around news literacy and teaching people how to read the news and find truth. There's really great people doing that work. And then we also have people in the church who are saying they're trying to figure out how to engage with our current culture and the things happening. And there wasn't a lot of things that kind of bridged those two worlds. And so my hope was that this book could help be in the middle, right? There's all these tools out there for finding truth, and then how do we give that to the church? And so I think in the last couple of years, as I've been doing these workshops, and then the last year since the book came out, just having the opportunity to have more conversations with people around that has been really great. I'd like to think that it's helped some folks think a little bit more deeply about how they consume news and how they're engaging with the people around them. And so that's been a really cool opportunity just to have those conversations and to share with people that might be surprised that there are churches that want, people outside the church, to say there are Christians that really want to engage well online and in the new, with news. And I think that's been a really fun opportunity to have those conversations with people I know outside the church, to say hey, I'm working with churches on identifying misinformation. And they're kind of oh, I didn't know churches would do that. And so I think that's been a really great opportunity too.
What are some of the key things that you want people to kind of take from the book and kind of implement in their daily lives?
Well, you've read the book, and as you know, like I go way beyond what I feel like is just like a checklist, right? What I hope people will take out of this is more than like a checklist of here's where you should get your news from and here's where you shouldn't get your news from. I really feel like what I hope people leave with is, yes, there are tools to identify different kinds of information. There's also a lot of internal work that I think we can do in these spaces. It can often feel like social media, the news, it's just like coming at us all the time. A lot of us have smartphones, right? They're like a computer in our pocket. So it just can feel like this constant, almost like noise. And so I hope people get out of it like some control, to really feel like I can take some agency back, and I don't have to be at the whim of everything I see when I'm scrolling. And I can have some control over how I respond. And I also hope people can get out of it some tools for how to talk to the people they care about. That is part of the book as well, in terms of like, we are having hard conversations with people and we're all seeing different information. And so, hoping people get some tools to just like think more carefully about like, how do I talk to my family about this current issue that we don't agree on, and where are we seeing our news about it, and how do we go from there?
And something you just mentioned about we're not always seeing the same information. Part of that is because of the algorithms that drive Google and Facebook and all these things, and what's called filter bubbles. I talked about it a little bit in the first episode that I did about this, but why don't you tell us a little bit about those algorithms and filter bubbles and how we end up not all seeing the same information?
Yeah, I was just talking with one of my colleagues about the algorithm on Twitter, now X, and his frustrations with it. But really, like these algorithms that are part of our social media, Google, all of these platforms, like you said, they're collecting this data on kind of what we're doing. What are we clicking on? What are we sharing? What are we liking? What are we pausing on? Where are we when we're looking at things? All of that. They're like taking all of this information, and then instead of just like showing us the next thing in our feed or on our Google results, that's like just like this is what's happening in order, it's making predictions and saying like, well, based on the fact that you've searched this or you've looked at this or you've clicked on this, maybe you want to see more of that. And so it can result, like you said, in these filter bubbles or echo chambers where like what I see on my social media feed or in my Google results is different than what you see. And so it really can create like very different, I mean, people kind of know this is happening. We talk about it with like, like I have searched for this thing and now I see ads for it. So I think there's a sense that people know it's happening, but I'm not sure if we always really take that to the next conclusion of like, how does that impact the news we see and what we're seeing going on around us? Like even last week I was traveling and I was out of town. And so I'm in Colorado and now some of my ads have changed, right? Because the platforms recognize that I'm in a different geographic location. And now I start seeing different news on my feed, which is fine. I'm like, sure, I don't mind seeing some Colorado news while I'm out there, but there are impacts to that, and I think we saw that certainly during COVID as well, right? Like what we were all seeing depended a little bit on where we were geographically, and so that could also impact just the way we see the world.
Absolutely. So another thing you spent some time talking about is the actual meaning of fake news. It's obviously been a term that's probably been really commonly in the lexicon since like 2016, and it means different things to different people. So what does it mean to you, and what do you think we should do with that term?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It has become sort of like this common term. I would love for fake news to just mean what it means, which is news that's not true. But it really has become so much more politicized than that. And generally, people use the term fake news when they're trying to be sort of like I don't know, a little bit provocative or just like make a point, right? And I think that's unfortunate. I actually end up in my book, although the title is Faith and Fake News, I actually don't use that term very much. I tend to lean more on terms like misinformation and disinformation, because I do think the term fake news has become, it's almost like, what does that mean anymore? Because all different people on different sides of issues are tossing it around, and a lot of people sometimes use that jokingly, or they use it to say, I don't agree with that. And so I think sometimes it can be a term that just actually ends up meaning nothing because it means so many different things to so many people.
I think it's similar to the way evangelical has gotten used. Like, it's become such a political term that it almost doesn't have a religious or spiritual meaning anymore. Or the term woke, which initially had like a social justice meaning, but then it's kind of been used as all kinds of different things. So some of these words just get overused to the point where they almost don't really mean very much. So
yeah, exactly.
yeah. One thing I thought was really interesting about the book is, as you get into the second portion of talking about kind of some of the more practical pieces of how to interact with information, you start off with a conversation about emotions and how important our emotions are. And that took me kind of by surprise, because I expected the book to kind of be very like fact based and like, here's how to check this thing, and kind of the method of how to assess information. And you do plenty of that, but I was surprised at what a big role emotion played in the book. Tell me a little bit more about that and why you think emotion is important in all of this.
Yeah, it's one of the pieces that I think that can get easily left out. And certainly there is this sense that, like, when I talk with a church or I do workshops even here, when I'm at my full-time job, right? Like, there is the sense of like, give me the facts, check the boxes. But I really think, like, we are human beings. God created us with emotions. These platforms are very emotional. There are a lot of studies that show that, like, the emotional content is what gets shared a lot. What's misinformation is often very emotional, gets shared a lot. And so to me, to separate out the pieces of us that are emotional and try to pretend that everything we do is logical wasn't going to work. And as I was working with all these churches, these types of things kept coming up. And as I was listening to people in terms of how they were engaging the news, a lot of them would talk about how it made them scared, it made them fearful. Engaging on social media was really upsetting to them. And they were starting to call out all of these emotions, whether they were intending to or not. And so, like, I just recognized that, like, I would love for it to be logical, but it's not. And my personality is definitely like more on the reflective side. And so I think I kind of realized I needed to bring that into the way I was teaching about this topic. And to expect people to just follow a checklist and be like, is this image real or not? Is this person an expert or not? To expect people to do that without having any emotional reaction just felt so unrealistic in the world that we live in. And so to me, it was just so important that this is something we talk about. And even when I speak with churches now, this is the part I never leave out. There's tons of resources about how to fact check an image, or don't find a different headline or things like that. Like, there's a lot of tools on that you can find on YouTube or anywhere else. But to have those more holistic conversations is a piece that I'm not seeing. I'm still not seeing. And it just felt like, how do we talk? If we're going to be the church, we need to, like, look at us as whole human beings. And part of that is also addressing the fact that these platforms are very emotional. They make people emotional. And so we can take, again, having some agency around, like, noticing what's happening inside of us can actually give us more agency in how we respond, give us space for how to respond, instead of just reacting out of those initial emotions.
Absolutely. So important to kind of understand what's going on in here as we engage with what's happening online and stuff. So after that, you talk about a variety of tools that help us to fact check information, talk about like things like lateral reading, several different tools. Which do you think are the most important of those tools to practice? I mean, they're all important on some level, but
Yeah.
what are maybe the ones that are most important or that you use the most?
Yeah. I would say like the lateral reading that you just mentioned is probably the broadest and like the most important because it can be applied in so many different situations. And lateral reading, I'm sure you talked about this, previously in your other episodes, but just like that stepping back and like before you consume a piece of information, whether it's a video, a news story, whatever, noticing who created it and like, is the sponsoring organization someone we want to trust? Is the author someone we trust? And taking that step back and then deciding like, okay, now that I've recognized that these people may have X, Y, and Z bias, or they have this perspective, now I'll watch the video with that in mind, as opposed to just consuming, watching, reading, whatever, and then reacting out of that. So I think the lateral reading piece just gives us so much more context for any piece of information that we're wondering about. And that's the one I tend to use the most, is just like, what is this? I never heard of this person. Like, who are they? And just doing a quick search, on my phone or on the computer and just saying like, okay, who are they? And then now, okay, I'll read this and get their perspective. So I would say, like you said, they're all important, but that's the one that I think can be used the most frequently and can be used in a lot of different scenarios.
And it sounds like it would be maybe a time consuming thing to do, but a lot of times it's not. And
Right.
You'll probably find this interesting. An example I had of this is a few years ago, when there was a lot of discussions about COVID vaccines and whether or not they were a good idea. I was watching a news channel and they found someone who was a doctor and brought this doctor on to get his perspective on the vaccines. And some of the things that he was saying made me a little skeptical. And so I just quickly Googled Dr. So-and-so at whatever university they were from. And I found them on the university page and found that they're an expert on dog cancers. This person's a veterinarian, which, is a lot of education, but they're not an infectious disease expert in humans. And so what do you recommend that people do when they do a fact check like that? They find out that this person is maybe not an expert on this subject they're being invited to talk about on the news. Do we just change the channel in that moment, or do we just tune it out, or do we try to stay with it and engage in some way?
Yeah, that is such a good example. And I think I have similar examples in my book. And during COVID, that was a huge thing, right? Doctors saying things, and then you realize like, oh, are they really an expert? That's a tough one. I mean, I know there are people that would probably argue like on all sides of what you just said. I generally tend to be like, okay, well, now I'm just going to find someone who is an expert and not worry too much about it. And yeah, there may be something in there that's useful, but as a whole, we don't have time to consume everything and then sift through it. So I think there is something to be said for saying like, you know what, I don't think this is really as reliable as I'm looking for. So I'm going to look at something else, and that's okay. And change our algorithm a little bit by finding someone else to look at, So I know that is such a good example, and it didn't probably even take you that long to look that up.
No, it took me like 10 seconds maybe. Yeah. I was like, oh, that was easy to find if they were actually a credible person to talk about disease in humans when they're actually a veterinarian. So
exactly.
Yeah, I was kind of thrown off by that. What is one of the things you talk about, because there's always discussion about bias in the media and, oh, that's a biased source. They're biased to the left, they're biased to the right, and so on. What do we do when we encounter bias? Because in the book you say, just because something is biased doesn't mean it's wrong or inaccurate. How do we kind of navigate that?
Yeah, I think that's it's a good question. And I think it is a hard thing to like find the nuance with, especially in the world we live in where can feel very polarizing or very divided. I tend to have my perspective is that everyone has a perspective. And so to expect us to find sources that are 100% neutral all the time just doesn't feel possible. All of these news organizations have perspective. Their journalists on their staff have perspectives. And so you have we're all humans again, and God created us with a lot of different perspectives. And so I tend to have the perspective or the idea that it's okay. It's okay if you notice some bias, like notice it, call it out. But that doesn't necessarily mean like they got the facts wrong on the story. Their interpretation might be different than yours, but the facts might still be correct. And it's something I talk about with my college students too, now they're working on like papers and assignments. But we might talk about like, hey, if you see perspective or bias in the sources that you're using, call it out in your paper. And I think we have somehow shied away from that. We kind of have this idea that like, oh, it's biased, so I can't engage with it at all. And it's like, well, everything's going to have a perspective. Everyone has a perspective. And so can we actually do a better job at learning to identify that as opposed to just dismissing it outright? And maybe reading something with a different perspective or bias might teach us something about how other people think about those topics or those social issues or whatever's going on. And so I think, I just don't think it's possible to find a perfectly neutral source. And instead we can choose to say like, okay, I recognize that there's some bias here. Are there pieces that are still factual? The who, what, where, when that we all did when we were kids. Are those pieces still factual? And then this is their interpretation of it. And recognizing that there's bias and there's opinions, right? We see a lot of things on social media and in the news that are opinions, and practicing recognizing those things, I think can go a long way in feeling less frustrated by this, like, oh, well, everything's just biased, I can't believe anything I hear.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. You also talk about the need to seek out other perspectives, in part because that's how, as Christians, we love other people, we listen to people and hear out what they're thinking, even if we may disagree with it, even on a very core spiritual level. So how do we go about that in healthy ways as Christians to seek out other perspectives?
Yeah, it's one of those things that, again, I think it goes against our human nature. There's also a lot of studies that show like we as human beings don't really want to engage with different perspectives. We're not good at it. We don't believe it. Sometimes if someone has a different perspective, we just aren't going to, like, there are studies that show like we don't believe those, like what they're saying. And so it can be really, really hard. I'm just such a big proponent of like purposefully choosing, like in the news, for example, choosing to follow different news sources. So not just saying, well, I only watch X, Y, and Z news source, but like saying, no, I'm going to choose to, like, on my social media, I'm going to follow these like 3 or 4 different news sites so that I can see a variety of news stories and see their perspectives. I think it also involves like having conversations with people who think things differently than us in a nice way. And then like just like being mindful of where those things are coming from in terms of news or social media, and choosing, like I said, choosing to follow a variety of news sources, choosing to go to their websites, choosing to subscribe. Like a lot of times I think we get caught by this idea that, the news should be free. And so we don't want to pay. We don't want to pay to have access to like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever news organization it is. But like being willing to like say, like, I'm going to invest in having a variety of perspectives, and I'm not going to just rely on what's free. I'm going to look for ways to engage with things that are from a variety of perspectives and a variety of places. Like I lived overseas for a while. Sometimes I like to look at the news from other parts of the world. What are they saying? So, and I know I mentioned it in the book, but there is a website called allsides.com. And they do a really good job of just like showing different news sites, and they're different political. Here in the US, we rely really heavily on political perspective. And so they kind of rate different news sources based on their political perspective. And that can be a really helpful tool just to say like, oh, wow, I'm only reading news from this perspective. What would it look like to pick a news source from a different side, if you will, that looks at the world a little bit differently. So
I'm trying to remember what page that all sides chart is on, because I'm trying to show a quick example of it.
Have the book too. That's a good, it's on page 117. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, it's made backwards for people, but it kind of organizes kind of like how far left-leaning or centrist or right-leaning different sources may be. And there's similar charts that you can find online. If you just Google something like a media bias chart or something, you'll find similar things that can kind of give you perspective of, okay, if I listen to this, what other things might be on the other end of the spectrum from what I normally listen to.
Correct. And I like to remind people, like, this is not a tool for us to say, like, oh, well, those people over there only read this. And, it's more of a like self-reflection, like, oh, wow, I really am only getting my news from basically a similar perspective. So what would it look like you said, to like love people and understand them? What would it look like to say, I'm going to choose to read something from a different perspective?
And even there, I think it's important to check our posture, because I was talking with someone about what news channels they watched. And to my knowledge, they only watched this particular news source over here. But then they mentioned also wanting to have access to this source over here that was kind of on the opposite end of the political spectrum. I'm like, really? I've never known you to watch news on that channel. And they said, oh, we need to know what the enemy is saying. And that just really surprised me. I was like, how are they the enemy? Like, they may have a different perspective from you, but they're not the enemy. Yeah. And so I think it's really important that when we seek these perspectives, we do so with love and with charity, because that's what Jesus does.
Right.
And not think of them necessarily as inherently opposed. That's just,
it's a good point.
That's my soapbox for the day.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one.
Throughout the book, you also do a variety of reflection questions like this one. When engaging with others online, will sharing an article or commenting on a friend's social media post bring glory to the kingdom of God? Questions like that, as well as various exercises to help people kind of maybe find some of these new perspectives. What was your goal in sharing these exercises and reflection questions? Do we all have to do them to read the book well? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons. I don't know how familiar you or your listeners are to the Enneagram, but I really identify as an Enneagram 4, which is like a pretty deep thinker and feeler. And so there's a part of me that this is just very natural for me, is to like say, like, this is more than just a surface level conversation. There are deeper things for us to think about. Whether that's in our own emotional state, like we mentioned, or it's some of these other things like spiritually, like what is bringing glory to the kingdom of God. And so there's like part of it for me is just like very personal, like this is how I think. So it's my book, so I put it in there. But seriously, like I also think these are the things that the church can do that maybe is a little bit countercultural, right? This social media platforms, the news, the culture we live in, again, is just like all this stuff coming at us all the time. And so if we want to choose to say we're going to be different, this is one way we can do it. We can say, we're going to think a little bit deeper about this. We're going to slow down. We're going to try some things. We're going to practice them. We're not just going to say, oh, those people over there need to do it. We're going to like own some of this and take that. And so my goal with adding things like reflection questions and activities and spaces for people was to help them own some of that and to like really internalize these things a little bit deeper. Again, it goes beyond the checklist. The checklist is easy, but the deeper part is harder. And that's the part that I think we can be different. It also, my hope was like, it gives people things to talk about. So like a lot of learning these things happens in community. And so like, what does it look like to have hard conversations even within our own communities and say like, yeah, how are we being salt and light online? Are we doing that? Like, what does it look like for us to do that together? And at the end of the day, a lot of the conversations I feel like I've had with churches and different groups, they ultimately feel like discipleship questions, right? Like if we're trying to be more like Jesus and we're trying to be more like Jesus in the ways we interact online and with the news and all of those things, providing people space to reflect on that felt really important to me, to say, we're not just going to give you a checklist. I don't do that with my college students. I'm not going to do it with the church. As a educator, it's like, how do I help you think critically about this? And so that to me, these questions, these activities, these opportunities for like more resources was really a chance to help people dig in a little bit deeper in the sense of like, how do we become more like Jesus? And we can do that if we ask some hard questions.
Absolutely. Now, I would say a lot of this kind of comes about and is difficult because so many of us, I think particularly in our generation and older, maybe a few years younger than us and older, we weren't really trained on media literacy because there just the amount of media available wasn't as it wasn't as much, 20, 30 years ago. And so how do we change that moving forward? Is Gen Z being better trained in media literacy than we were because there's just so much of it already, and so they're getting better at knowing when to check things? Like, what do we do here?
No, I have the same questions. I think, as I'm working with more and more, I'm working more with Gen Z in the last couple of years, obviously. I do think that there is a little bit more base understanding of some of these, like, especially things like algorithms. I feel like again, this is pretty anecdotal. I haven't read a lot of studies on it, but I do think there are, like, the college students I work with generally are kind of like, yeah, we know it. Like, we just know that's happening. But I don't know I think that's also why I'd like to talk about some of the deeper issues on these things, because I don't know if we're talking about those things. Right? We might be talking with students in high school or younger, right? Like some of these topics, but I still don't know if we're getting at some of those deeper heart issues around, like, what does it look like to be like a person that seeks different perspectives? What does it look like to be a person that, like, loves our neighbors really well? And so I think there's, like, there is work being done, certainly with, like, K-12 and Gen Z, and, like, giving those media literacy tips and, like, teaching about that. But it's also not consistent, like, I just think of, like, how our educational system is set up in the US. Like, it can vary a lot from state to state, from city to city. And so even within, younger folks, the experience people have with some of these concepts can vary quite a bit.
Yeah. So since the book is still relatively new. It's only been out for a couple of years. Has anything, to your knowledge, really changed in the information landscape that you would maybe put in, like, an updated version of the book or something? Like, because everything's just evolving so quickly.
Yes.
So what changes do we have happening? I think of AI right off the top of my head. That suddenly within the last year become much more of a prominent conversation.
Definitely AI is a big thing that makes this book already feel dated. And because I wasn't talking about it, it wasn't as much of a part of the conversation when I was writing this. And so certainly that, I think, on a very practical level, the way we consume information has changed, even to more and more, like, video and sound clips. Like, I feel like what I'm seeing more and more on social media is, like, the videos are the things that get the attention, whereas, like, even just static images are getting maybe a little bit less attention in terms of that, like, share, like, engagement. And so that's one thing I have noticed right away, is, like, just the type of content people consume is changing to that more video, multimedia, and then definitely the AI piece in terms of knowing what to trust and people being very skeptical. I feel like skepticism, again, this is pretty anecdotal, but I feel like the conversations I've had with folks in the last year have gotten even more skeptical. And a lot of, like, well, AI, maybe it's AI, maybe AI made it. And so, like, there's this sense of, like, a heightened piece of that kind of, like, distrust.
Yeah. Well, I've experienced that recently. Like, I was on Facebook and, I saw a post that was supposedly one of the two vice presidential candidates dancing provocatively in, like, a skimpy leather outfit. And I saw it and I was like, I don't think this can be real. And so I fact checked it real quick, and sure enough, it told me that, here's the original video of the actual person who'd been dancing, into the song or whatever in that outfit. And here's how it was just, like, an AI imposition of the candidate's face onto that, and how AI kind of helped fake that. And I was like, this was too easy for someone to put together and make it look somewhat real and have people believing it. So yeah, it's kind of scary. And I kind of don't know what to do with the cynicism that I'm kind of feeling developing in me. Yeah, it's kind of alarming.
No, I agree. And I feel like I'm in a similar place, like, trying to learn as much as I can to understand what's going on in terms of the information landscape. I mean, similarly, like in the last couple of weeks, there have been a lot of like those 2 hurricanes in the southeast. And maybe you saw there was like an image that got passed around a lot on social media of a little girl holding a puppy. And it was AI generated, but it was like creating all of this like content sharing around what was happening to people in that area and victims of the hurricane. And not to say the devastation isn't real, but the image that people were using to represent it wasn't. And so that's another like piece that I think we're all wrestling with, is like there were some people that were like, well, it doesn't take away from the devastation, and yet the image isn't real. So like, what do we do with that? Like these things, like you hold both of that, and like, what do you do with all of the images that in this case it was like, well, it's not like it was a harmful image, but it's not realistic. And so, or it was realistic, but it wasn't real. And so, yeah, it's just like a lot of questions. And I think I'm in a place personally where I'm just trying to like figure out what does it seem like AI is good for, and then like it's hard to figure that out. And then like, yeah, I'm trying to learn so much in terms of like what is happening, because I also sometimes feel very cynical about it. And so how can I try to learn as much as I can? And it's so overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah. Right now, the only thing I can think of AI being good for is like editing random people out of the backgrounds of scenic photos or something like that. That seems like an okay, acceptable use of AI. But one of the last questions I have, what should we know about how to consume information wisely as we're in the last like 2.5 weeks of a very chaotic and contentious presidential election cycle? Well, not just presidential, other elections as well. What should we know right now about how to consume information wisely as we lead up to Election Day?
I think I would say there's still time to read multiple perspectives. There's not a lot of time left before the election. I think there's like the piece of like reading multiple perspectives. And I don't know, this is going to sound really funny probably, but I also think there's something to be said for like knowing our own limits, right? That's that emotional awareness of like, when are we just engaging with the news to like feed our own, what's the word? I don't know, like emotional, kind of like you were saying before, even like the enemy, what's the enemy doing? Like, when are we just consuming news to just kind of like engage in this like yucky side of it instead of just like educating ourselves or understanding other perspectives? And I think there's some self-awareness in these last couple of weeks of like, if you've done research, you kind of know where you're at. Like, we don't need to just like fuel that emotional piece of the news cycle, right? We can say, we have done our research on the candidates we want to vote for, and like, then it moves into the like, how do we talk to other people about it, right? How do we be kind? At the end of the day, to me, those are the fruits of the spirit are more important than like us engaging with the news in a gross way. So like, how do we engage in the last couple of weeks in things like being kind and caring about our neighbor and like having fruitful conversations and not engaging? Because it's just I think the next couple of weeks are just gonna be tons of news and lots of fuel on the fire as all the candidates, whether it's national or not, right? They're all trying to get votes. And so the news cycles are going to feel really fast. They're going to feel really overwhelming. And so I think there's something to be said for like, where do we just like take a step back? Where do we like know our own limits? Where do we engage with kindness and love our neighbors? I mean, I've had some of this election cycle, I've had to take some breaks from social media. I just say like, I'm going to choose to engage in a few key news sources on my own. And I'm just not going to engage with that. And I'm going to choose to have conversations with people in person, not online. And I think that to me is the way forward as people who are Christians who want to love our neighbors. It's not necessarily about engaging with all this chaos, right? And saying like, how do we remain calm and steady and centered? And at the end of the day, we know like Jesus is on his throne. And so how do we stay grounded in that? Without feeling like we have to get sucked into all of the news cycles. We need to know what's going on in the world, but I don't think we need to be like feeding into all of that. So Absolutely. It's a kind of a non-answer, but I just feel like if you know your limits, know your limits.
Well, now I was actually just thinking about that today because I was just kind of noticing, oh, I'm a lot happier because like back in June, I went to a conference and just because I was busy, I ended up not really looking at my news apps for a few days. And I was like, that was really nice. And I've just kind of kept that going. And I've learned like I want to balance staying informed with my mental health,
Yeah.
and so I've found ways to kind of keep I've been learning where my threshold is of where can I be informed but not have these things consume my mind and prompt my anxiety and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, I think I'm learning what my limits are. Like you were just talking about, know your limits, and it's okay. You don't have to know everything. Like we can be informed citizens and be informed about how God is moving in the world without having to know every single thing that might upset us. Because most of us is just going to upset us. So
Exactly.
let's just intentionally take some space to do that. So I really appreciate that wisdom.
Yeah.
So that's kind of all the questions that I wanted to cover. Are there any last things that you want to say just about the book or about any of this at all?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and I hope the people in your church are finding the book helpful. I really do hope that it fills a space that I think, if we're honest with ourselves, is where like there is that deeper sense of like, that doesn't feel great. So like, how can we be more mindful? How can we be more kind and just caring and bring that? How can we be different in these spaces? And spreading misinformation is not loving our neighbors, but what is? What does it look like to love our neighbors? And I think we can continue to ask ourselves, and like, how do we love people well, even online?
Absolutely. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. This is actually the first time I've had the author of a book that I've talked about on the podcast on. So again, the
Cool.
book is Faith and Fake News by Rachel Wightman, who is with us today. I'll include a link in the show notes to Amazon where you can purchase the book. Strongly recommend it. If anybody wants to borrow my copy, I'm done with it for now, so you'll have to give it back. But thank you again, Rachel. And thanks to all of you who are watching or listening. And I hope you have a wonderful and blessed day.